Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 75, The Forgotten Son. First of all, sorry for last week's cliffhanger ending. Somehow the final cut got truncated when I wasn't looking. Luckily, or maddeningly or something, it only dropped the last 8 words. So for those of you who haven't gone back and downloaded the corrected version, which is posted by the way, I'll just go ahead and spoil the ending. Senatorial historians were doing their best to confine Domitian to the dustbin of history. Then the music plays. That was all that was left. Sorry about that. But as much as the Senate tried to literally purge Domitian from the collective consciousness, passing an edict damning his memory just days after the emperor was assassinated, and then proceeding to expunge his name from public records and monuments, Domitian reigned for too long and had too much of an impact to simply be ignored. So, failing to erase his memory completely, sympathetic historians of senatorial rank ran a fairly uniform smear campaign against him that was picked up and promulgated by later church scholars who further identified the evil Domitian as an early persecutor of Christians. So, for the better part of 1800 years, the perception that Domitian was one of the worst emperors in Roman history persisted. But in the 20th century, his memory has been rehabilitated some, most notably by Brian Jones's The Emperor Domitian, and he is now understood to be an undeniably autocratic ruler, but one who was far more effective and rational than early sources give him credit for. Titus Flavius Domitianus was born on October 24, 51 AD, the youngest son of the year's newly elected consul Vespasian. For the first few years, the Flavian nuclear family was strong and stable. Vespasian withdrew from public life following the rise of Agrippina, and was around to supervise the upbringing of his 3 children, Titus, who was 12 years Domitian's senior, daughter Domitilla, 6 years older, and Domitian himself. But as was sometimes typical in Roman families, while Vespasian took a keen interest in his eldest son's education and a keen interest in finding his daughter a husband, he did not take much interest at all in his youngest son. Not that Domitian did not receive a first-rate education, just that by the time he was born, Titus was almost an adult, and Vespasian naturally looked at the older boy as the bearer of his legacy. Domitian, unfortunately, became little more than an afterthought in his father's eyes. Titus was shipped off to Germania to begin his public career when Domitian was 7, and a few years later, Vespasian accepted a governorship in North Africa, leaving the 12-year-old Domitian at home with his mother and sister, and he naturally grew much closer to them than the 2 men to whom he is historically connected. But by the time his father and brother left for Judea in 66 AD, both women were dead. The causes of death are unknown, but they left the 15-year-old Domitian virtually alone in the world. And during this period, he developed a penchant for solitude, a very un-Roman-like trait that would be inevitably pointed out by his enemies as they ticked off all the things that made the monster Domitian such an abomination. "Where's Domitian?" someone would ask. "Alone in the palace," would come the witty reply, "with not even a fly." Of course, this joke worked doubly well, because it was rumored that Domitian liked to sit around and stab flies with a penknife, but that is neither here nor there. The virtually orphaned Domitian was handed off to Vespasian's brother Flavius Sabinus, and he was still living in his uncle's home when the events of 68 and 69 AD swept across the empire. When it comes to contrasting the roots of the generous and positive reigns of Vespasian and Titus with the jealous and negative reign of Domitian, one can look obviously to the circumstances of his upbringing and the humiliating slights he would receive under the reign of his father, and one would be right to do so. But there is another little thing that no doubt colored Domitian's whole worldview. He was actually physically present in Rome during the last mad days of Nero, then the massacres that greeted the arrival of Galba, then the violent coup orchestrated by Otho, then the occupation of the city by Vitellius's Rhine legions, and then, finally, the sacking of Rome by Antonius's army. Not only did he endure the paranoia of being related to a prominent politician at a time when standing out was likely to get you purged by the capricious Nero or the scheming pedagogues, but he also saw up close and personal just how readily the Senate swung with the political breeze, and how much that political breeze was blown by violence. Every time some usurper got the upper hand, the Senate was right there to retroactively justify their most heinous crimes. One minute they were praising you to the stars, the next they were hailing your assassins as state heroes. The Senate as a body had many characteristics, but loyalty to the sitting emperor was clearly not one of them, and it was a lesson Domitian would not soon forget. He spent his latter teenage years surrounded by backstabbers, plotters, and the senators who enabled them. It should come as no surprise, then, that in contrast to his laid-back father and brother, Emperor Domitian would rule with a strong and vigilant hand, and do everything he could to enfeeble the Senate, who he knew full well would turn on him the minute he looked away. Ironically, of course, this paranoid disposition would become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the Flavian most worried about assassination would be the only one to die a violent death. Life's funny that way. As the son of a prominent Neronian general, Domitian had lived into 69 AD as a sort of unofficial political hostage. But when Vespasian launched his own bid for the throne, the target on Domitian's back threatened to overwhelm the young man. By the time Vitellius arrived in the city, Vespasian's eastern revolt was well underway, and the Vitellians were quick to locate their rival's youngest son and place him under house arrest. Vitellius hoped that by keeping Domitian hostage, Vespasian would think twice about his plans, but of course Antonius's aggressive invasion of Italy took the decision out of Vespasian's hands completely, though whether he would have let Vitellius's threats to harm Domitian deter him is still an open question. When Vitellius attempted to abdicate the throne, Domitian was freed from his confinement and accompanied his uncle Sabinus as the latter marched to the Forum to deliver a message on Vespasian's behalf. This meant that Domitian was with his uncle when the Flavian entourage ran into the still defiant Vitellians and fought in the ensuing street fight that drove the Flavians up onto the Capitoline Hill. When it was clear that the impromptu siege was not going to end well, Domitian was snuck off the hill dressed as an adherent of the cult of Isis. He slipped into a passing religious procession and escaped the fate of his less fortunate uncle. When Antonius's army smashed their way into Rome a few days later, Domitian was liberated from his hiding place and hailed as Caesar by the triumphant Flavian troops, who carried the 18-year-old on a shield to his father's house. Suddenly, the boy who had always been relegated to the background found himself standing right smack dab in the middle of everything. But his time in the limelight was short-lived. When Mucianus arrived in the city, he quickly co-opted Domitian and relegated the boy to a closely guarded ceremonial position. As the son of Vespasian, he had enormous value and was assigned the task of representing his father's interests in the Senate, but he was kept away from real power, and any Flavian supporter who seemed inclined to back Domitian over Mucianus was rapidly promoted away to positions in the provinces. While he waited for his father to arrive, Domitian dutifully attended sessions of the Senate and spoke on his father's behalf, and it was very likely that during these formative months that the future Emperor Domitian's disdain for the body cemented itself. There was no escaping the fact that the Senate had no real authority and seemed driven by nothing so much as the vanity of old men. Domitian endured their endless speeches, all the while longing to get out of this sideshow and onto the main stage. Like most young men of his age and ambition, Domitian craved the opportunity to prove himself in the field of battle. He had tried to talk his father into taking him to Judea at the outset of the Jewish revolt, but this request was dismissed out of hand. He was far too young and would only get in the way. By the time he was old enough to join the legions in his own right, the whole empire was turned upside down, and Domitian was forced to sit on the sidelines while the rest of his family bathed themselves in military glory. With his father now emperor, Domitian was sure to be granted a position somewhere in the legions, if not a command, then at least something close to it. The Batavian revolt offered the perfect opportunity, and Domitian jumped at the chance to join Mucianus as the imperial administrator raised reinforcements to lead north to crush the rebellion. Mucianus was hesitant to put the boy in charge of troops, not just because he was totally inexperienced, but also because he would become a dangerous rival for the army's loyalty. Fortunately for Mucianus and unfortunately for Domitian, the revolt was put down before the armies from Rome got anywhere near the front lines, and the unfulfilled Domitian was returned to Rome. Sensing that Mucianus did not perhaps have his best interests at heart, Domitian wrote a letter directly to the commander of the Rhine legions, who just so happened to be his uncle-in-law, asking for a command, but his uncle essentially ignored the request. When Vespasian arrived in Rome later that year, Domitian then was still stuck, shut out of political power, and denied a military post. The young man may have hoped that the arrival of his father would correct this situation, but it was apparent from the get-go that Vespasian had no interest in raising Domitian out of his glum irrelevancy. Despite being one of only 2 sons, Domitian was treated with remarkable indifference by Vespasian, who, like always, seemed to only have eyes for Titus. In fact, when Titus returned from the east and Vespasian granted his eldest son a triumph, Domitian was forced to trail behind the vanguard led by his father and brother, relegated to the spot reserved for other family members. This would prove to be Domitian's lot in life for the remainder of his father's decade in office. Where Titus was granted near co-equal status with Vespasian, Domitian was assigned only ceremonial positions. Aside from being trotted out every once in a while to preside over some archaic ceremony or another, Domitian faded completely from public view. He spent most of his time in the imperial palace, reading and writing, and generally resigning himself to the life of obscure scholarship that he seemed destined for. In fact, if it hadn't have been for the influence of Titus, Domitian likely would not have been allowed any practical governmental experience at all before attaining the throne for himself in 81 AD. Though he had never been close to his so much younger brother, Titus seemed at least aware of Domitian's existence. Not to get off on too much of a tangent, but by the time of the imperial period, consulships still existed, but they were no longer the yearly affairs that they had been during the Republican era. In order to satisfy the many grasping elites who all clamored to add consul to their list of public accomplishments, the consulship turned into an office held for months and sometimes even days. The most prestigious slot was to begin the year in office, as the Roman dating system still named the years after the consuls in office on January the 1st. These men were called the consuls ordinarii, and once they had served for a few months, they often resigned in favor of new candidates who were known as suffect consuls. Vespasian assigned Titus to 7 ordinarii consulships during his time in office, while granting Domitian only 1. But aware that his brother needed much more practical experience than this, Titus ensured that when he resigned from his consulships, that Domitian took over as suffect consul, bringing his younger brother's total to a less prestigious but still respectable 6 consulships. I think the main difference between Vespasian and Titus's attitude towards Domitian is that the former was an old man who felt that the issue of succession was a done deal, and beyond Titus, he didn't really have to worry about it, while the much younger and sonless Titus still had to consider the possibility that Domitian would don the purple one day. While Domitian got absolutely nowhere with his father when it came to career advancement, he was able to get his way when it came to his private life. He warded off a plot hatched by Vespasian to marry him off to Titus's daughter to ensure the purity of the dynasty, and in 70 AD, he married the woman he loved, Domitia Longia. The match may not have been the one Vespasian wanted, but politically it was an excellent pairing. Domitia was the youngest daughter of the great general Corbulo, who had spent his life in service to the empire, and had been rewarded by Nero with an order to commit suicide. Connecting the Flavians to this great senatorial family raised the profile of both, and established the Flavians as a family of anti-Neros, and signaling to those who had previously opposed the imperial regimes of the past that they could find a home in this new dynasty. Beyond the political upside, the marriage seemed to be a happy one, and despite a brief hiccup shortly after Domitian became emperor, the two remained devoted to each other for the rest of their lives. Just as he had hoped the arrival of Vespasian in Rome would deliver him from powerless obscurity, Domitian held out similar hopes when his brother ascended to the throne in 79 AD. But just as before, Domitian was disappointed. This time, the snub was more acutely felt, as Titus had specifically promised him a greater role in government once he became emperor. Now, in Titus's defense, it may have been that he was fully planning on following through with his promise and died before he could take any concrete steps. But for the 2 years he reigned, Domitian's status changed very little. It is at this point in the story that the ancient historians really start to get their digs in on the man they so love to hate, casting Domitian as an undisciplined and scheming cad who did everything in his limited power to undermine his handsome and wonderful brother. Suetonius even paints a scene in which Titus, after discovering that Domitian has been plotting against his life yet again, confronts his brother and pleads with him to remain an honorable partner, reminding him that at this point he is Titus's chosen successor, so there was no need for shifty violence. Following the sudden death of Emperor Titus, rumors were dutifully handed around that Domitian had a hand in the tragedy, and, even if he hadn't killed his brother, he certainly proved himself to be unworthy of the Flavian name in his conduct immediately following his brother's fatal illness. Rather than taking the time to mourn his brother properly, Domitian instead left the corpse behind and hurried to the Praetorian camp to have himself hailed emperor. However it really happened, and however much he really felt the loss of his older brother, it is true that on September the 14th, 81 AD, just a day after Titus died, Domitian called a session of the Senate and was confirmed as Augustus. The forgotten son of Vespasian was now master of the Roman Empire. As I've mentioned, Domitian arrived in office with a very different idea about how to wield power than any of his predecessors. The Julio-Claudians, even the craziest of them, had always followed in Augustus's footsteps and pretended that the mechanisms of the old republic still had power. Vespasian and Titus had both continued this tradition, not seeing any reason to upset a political apple cart that had so recently been set right. But Domitian had no use for this play acting. His experience had taught him that the Senate was an ineffective partner at best and a dangerous threat to the imperial peace at worst. The Republic had been dead for more than a century. There was no use pretending otherwise. All that Rome required was an enlightened despot to guide the ship of state wisely, and placating the Senate was an unnecessary and inefficient distraction from the kind of enlightened despotism the empire needed to flourish. Not lacking in ambition or ego, Domitian decided to model his new administration on no less a figure than the greatest enlightened despot of them all, the divine Augustus. But though Domitian's policies would prove themselves to be clearly Augustan in both scope and quality, in the end, he completely missed the insight that had made Augustus so successful. Rather than publicly castrating the Senate, the first emperor had obsessively maintained the charade of democracy, knowing full well that giving a little publicly meant getting a lot privately. In contrast, Domitian dragged the ugly realities of imperial rule right out into the open, and very loudly concentrated all power in the imperial palace, refusing to even pay lip service to the self-important windbags down in the Senate house. Where Augustus had styled himself as princeps, merely your first citizen, Domitian preferred Domitian, your lord and god. One could argue that the unsentimental administration set up by Domitian was more efficient than the touchy-feely charade of Augustus. But what one cannot argue is that when Augustus died, they made him a god, and his name became synonymous with supreme authority. Whereas when Domitian died, they toppled his statues and damned his name. But despite his ultimately fatal unwillingness to play act, in every other way, Domitian sought to emulate Rome's first and greatest emperor. In the breadth of his interests and the depths of his management, Domitian sought to usher in nothing less than an Augustan Renaissance. First up on his list of things to do was to reaffirm the divine status of the Caesars. The recent civil wars had perhaps given some the idea that donning the purple was simply a matter of controlling the strongest army or the sneakiest assassins. Domitian wanted to remind everyone that the imperial dynasties were divinely ordained, and that the past emperors were nothing less than gods themselves. If you're thinking about making a bid for the throne, just ask yourself, are you a god? Or are you descended from a god? If not, then you'd better just pack it up right now. So his first official act as emperor was to push through an edict deifying his deceased brother Titus to join his already deified father. But unlike Titus's push to have Vespasian deified, Domitian refused to submit himself to the plotting of the Senate, who had only approved godhood for Vespasian 6 months after the latter's death. Domitian had no patience for such stalling, and simply declared the divinity of his brother without waiting for senatorial approval. This total abandonment of protocol was the opening salvo in Domitian's running war on the obsolete institution. The new emperor then set to work, closely tying himself not to the Senate, but to the gods. He finished the rebuild of the Temple of Jupiter, adding splendid flourishes that were sure to please the king of the gods, and then set to work building a lesser shrine to Jupiter the Protector in the home that he had hidden himself in during the final dark days of Vitellius's reign. Capping off this initial flurry of religious monument building, Domitian completed the temple of Vespasian and Titus, where the people of Rome would be encouraged to actively worship his deceased and now divine father and brother. Domitian's point was clear. The emperor was not the first among equals. He was nothing less than the god's appointed representative on earth. With the gods firmly in his corner, Domitian then set about reorganizing how the state went about its daily business. He unceremoniously stripped the Senate of all practical authority and ensured that they were cut out of the decision-making process completely. No more debates, no more delays, no more humoring long, irrelevant elites. If the emperor wanted something done, he was just going to order it done, and that was that. The Senate was shocked that the new emperor refused them even the slightest consideration, and they quickly grew to despise him. This was fine with Domitian, as he really didn't care what they thought. He had an empire to run, and tiptoeing around the sensitivities of rich old men was not how he planned to spend his days. But as much as this embittered the elites, the common people loved it. Because though Domitian was every bit the dictatorial autocrat, he seemed focused on weeding out corruption and streamlining the tax code and making things fairer, not wallowing in his own hedonism. The corrupt upper classes had been growing fat for years, while the emperors had turned a blind eye. Now, it seemed the bill was finally coming due. But this is not to say that Domitian was some fire-breathing populist like Julius Caesar had been. He was not on a crusade for social justice. He just saw the nobility as far more of a hindrance than a help when it came to administrative work, and so he cut them loose. What Domitian was looking for was hard-working, loyal, conscientious, and honest administrators to help him govern, and the senatorial class did not seem particularly well stocked with any of these types. Sweeping aside the old order, Domitian instead elevated men of the lower-ranking equestrian class to positions they never would have been considered for in another administration. This not only filled the government with men of merit, it also filled the government with men intensely loyal to Domitian, to whom they owed their jobs, their lives, and their careers. The new emperor's zeal for eschewing the hereditary politics of the past even extended to his own family. Breaking with every imperial tradition in the book, Domitian abandoned nepotism, refusing to fill key positions with family members just because they were family members. If they could do the job, then they could have the job, but being a relative of the emperor was no longer a free pass. Despite his lack of experience and the low regard his own father seems to have held him in, Domitian was in fact turning out to be a bold and innovative emperor. Eventually, of course, his flagrant disregard for elite opinion would come back to haunt him, but for the time being, Emperor Domitian was successfully reinventing the office he held. Through his reforms, including his decision to declare himself censor in perpetuity so he could control the senatorial rolls and expel members who opposed him, the seat of power in the empire was now no longer Rome itself. Domitian famously moved around more than any other emperor since Augustus, and wherever he went, he brought the imperial court with him. This subtle shift was a big deal in the politics of the empire. When Tiberius had absented himself to Capri, the politics of the time required him to rely on a man in Rome to run the government. It was understood that while the emperor may have left, Rome was still where the action was. By contrast, when Domitian absented himself to Gaul or to Illyricum or to Moesia, it was understood that power went with him. Next time, we'll get more into what Domitian did with all the power he was so jealously hoarding, and why he was traveling the empire more than any emperor since Augustus. There will be no episode next week, as it is Thanksgiving here in the United States, but we'll be back in 2 weeks, ready to dive headlong into Domitian's everlasting quest for military glory and his ever-annoying need to control every little detail of Roman life. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 76, Mock Triumphs. Last time, we traced Domitian's rise to power from forgotten afterthought to Emperor of the Roman Empire. Unlike his brother, Domitian's rise had no planned arc. There was no gentle addition of responsibility, no subtle raising of the volume. When it came to Domitian, 1 minute there was silence, the next, the amp was cranked to 10. Imperial non-entity to master of the world in just the blink of an eye. His sudden inheritance of the throne shocked everyone, as the citizens of the empire were just getting settled into the nice long reign of Titus, and there was fear all around that the 30-year-old Domitian would not be up to the task. But this fear was generally unfounded, and Domitian would prove both intellectually and politically that he had what it took to be emperor. Even though his blunt dismissal of the Senate eventually led to assassination, for 15 years, Domitian ruled effectively in the manner he saw fit and efficiently got done what he thought needed to be done. The reign of Domitian is not to be sneezed at or ignored or ridiculed, though neither is it to be embraced as the second coming of Augustus, as Domitian would have liked us to believe. And in many ways, he set the stage for the coming century of brilliance for the empire. Suetonius once commented that the depravity of the last Flavian practically negated the good of the first two, but this is propaganda. Domitian was harsher and colder than his brother and father, but he was as astute and capable a man as they, and in the end, the whole of the Flavian dynasty should be remembered for their successful stewardship of the empire. Domitian opened his reign, as I said last time, with a flurry of pious construction projects, completing the Temple of Jupiter and unveiling a temple for his now divine relatives, Titus and Vespasian. But he did not plan to stop at a few temples. The city of Rome had been ravaged by war and natural disaster, most recently suffering from the Great Fire of 80 AD, and Domitian saw an opportunity to kick off his planned Augustan Renaissance in style. The first emperor had famously inherited a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Domitian was inheriting a city of ashes, and he planned to leave it a city of, well, buildings and stuff. Something functional, anyway. That didn't turn out nearly as poetic as I hoped when I started that sentence. Over the course of the next few years, he would direct the completion of some 50 new buildings, restoring the architectural dignity of Rome, which had been in steep decline since the reign of Nero. Among his many projects was the Arch of Titus, which was completed soon after his brother's death. The Great Arch, which still stands today and is a can't-miss on any trip to Rome, ostensibly commemorates Titus's victory in Judea, but mostly its job was to remind everyone of the divine, almost mythological status of the Flavians. Whether or not the Romans saw it as anything more than outsized self-aggrandizement is an open question, But the grand permanence of the structure certainly convinced later ambitious men that a massive arch was a pretty sweet way to celebrate one's own eternal awesomeness. Napoleon certainly had the Arch of Titus in mind when he ordered the Arc de Triomphe built after his own great victory at Austerlitz in 1806. All of these public building projects helped stimulate an economy that had been drifting aimlessly for years. But of course, they were not going to pay for themselves. So, having undercut the Roman elite politically, Domitian next targeted them economically, and let his newly reformed and ruthlessly efficient bureaucracy loose on their bank accounts. He strengthened and extended imperial taxes, and in the years to come would eventually resort to outright confiscation to help pay for his projects, and of course the various military campaigns he initiated, which we'll get to in a bit. Now, if he were another man, Domitian would have paid for everything without resorting to excessive taxation. Emperors in the past had simply borrowed what they needed without regard for how they were going to pay it back. Besides, if the creditors did come calling, an emperor could simply devalue the coins he minted until he had enough nominal chunks of worthless metal to pay the specific amounts that everyone demanded. Domitian had no interest in inflating his way into solvency, though, and taking the opposite tack, he actually returned the silver ratio in a denarii back to the Augustan level of 12%. Roman currency was the standard in the Mediterranean at the time, and Domitian felt that it reflected badly on the emperor to have the coins he minted regarded as worthless jokes. But of course, with less circulating currency to work with, Domitian was forced to demand more from his subjects. The Roman economy, on balance, benefited from Domitian's fiscal policies, but they certainly did not help his popularity any. Helping his popularity even less than his tax policies was his hopeless quest to return the Romans to their traditional, conservative family values. Legislating sex and morals had been hard enough for Augustus a century earlier, but Domitian's attempt to revive these least successful policies of the first emperor turned out to be an even more terrible idea. But Domitian seemed dead set on reviving all things Augustan, even if it meant bringing back the much derided Lex Julia. In 85 AD, Domitian named himself censor in perpetuity, which gave him authority to legislate public morality. Adultery once again became a banishable offense, and consorting with the Vestal virgins became a capital crime. An equestrian found himself stricken from the juror pool for remarrying an ex-wife, and a senator was expelled from the body for acting on stage, which was even worse than prostitution so far as Domitian was concerned. All of this turned out to be little more than spitting into a hurricane, and Domitian earned himself nothing but scorn for his trouble. The old ways were dead. Threatening to execute people for cheating on their wives was not going to change that. But Domitian forged on, and his efforts at reestablishing some semblance of public morality was not a total fool's errand. The emperor also used his authority as censor to punish officials for bribery and corruption, two real offenses with real consequences that had been overlooked for years, even by his own father. There was, as they say, a new sheriff in town, and even though he kicked up a lot of dust and made a lot of enemies over ultimately irrelevant sexual stuff, the government was never again as clean or honest in its dealings. The funny thing about all of this is that Domitian kept stepping on the same toes over and over again. It seems like any time he had the opportunity to stick it to the nobility, he jumped at the chance. I'm not sure what the Senate did to elicit such contempt from the emperor. I speculated about some stuff last time, but he really had it in for them. So much so that it doesn't even seem like a matter of stepping on a few toes. More like Domitian was walking right up to them and stomping down on their feet repeatedly. He cut them out of the political process, gouged them financially, policed their bedrooms, and shut down their lucrative kickbacks. In the end, I'm not sure why Domitian hated the Senate so much, but I have no doubts about why they hated him so much. He even declared a limit to the amount of arable Italian land that could be used for vineyards. So to top everything off, Domitian was also cutting down the booze supply. Is it any wonder, then, that he was finally stabbed to death? Beyond the aristocracy, who uniformly hated him, Domitian was alternatively feared and liked and disdained and respected, depending on who you talked to. But there was one segment of the population who really loved the man: rank-and-file soldiers. The officers couldn't stand Domitian, of course, for all the reasons I've mentioned and all the reasons I'll get to shortly. But the common legionary loved him. Why the great discrepancy? Because shortly after taking office, Domitian issued a blanket pay raise for his soldiers. And it wasn't some cost of living increase either. No, the common soldiers saw their paychecks increase by fully 1/3, a mind-blowing sum that earned Domitian their undying devotion for the rest of his reign. The elites could clamor for his head as much as they wanted, but after the pay raise, they were going to have a hell of a time convincing their soldiers to revolt. You want me to fight who? The guy who just gave me a 33% bump? No, I think I'm good, thanks. The raise caused Domitian to backtrack on his fiscal policy some, and he was forced to slightly devalue his coins after having so recently revalued them. But the compromise was a sound one, and Domitian never really had to worry about the whole army rising up against him. There was a brief revolt of 2 legions in 89 AD, which we'll get to next week, but it was an isolated case and was quickly crushed by the intensely loyal armies that surrounded the malcontents. The pay raise for the soldiers did not come out of nowhere, though. It was part and parcel of the triumphal celebration following Domitian's smashing victory against the Chatti in 83 AD. The fierce Germanic tribe had suddenly risen up in revolt against Rome right around the time Domitian decided that it was high time he cemented his reputation as a great leader with an impressive military victory. It was actually pretty convenient how it all worked out. Domitian just happened to be in Chatti territory conducting a census with a new legion he had recently formed when, for no reason, and in stark contrast to years of peaceful coexistence, the dastardly Chatti attacked, forcing Domitian to defend the honor of the house of Caesar and the majesty of Rome, etc., etc., etc. Convenient. Yes, that's one word for it. Domitian marched around for a year building roads and fortifications in Chatti territory, decided that with winter coming it was high time he declared victory and left, so he declared victory and left. He returned to Rome to celebrate the triumph he had been craving all his life. No one who knew anything about anything believed Domitian had actually done anything to earn the triumph he threw for himself. He had what? Skirmished with some random tribe and built some roads, and now was calling himself Germanicus? But the people loved it. Triumphs mean games, and banquets, and generous handouts. So they cheered their conquering emperor as he marched into the city at the head of his great parade. Domitian cheerfully basked in the glow of his adoring subjects. Never again would he be relegated to the back with the other family members. This was Domitian's time now. Meanwhile, Tacitus, representing the views of the aristocracy, dismissed the whole display as a mock triumph. Real or mock, Domitian capped his celebration by announcing a pay raise for his brave soldiers. That, at least, was real enough. One possible side consequence of Domitian's mock triumph was that Agricola, and yes, thank you for the pronunciation correction, it is Agricola, not Agricola, which, yeah, I agree, sounds like some kind of terrible hippie soda, so I'm sorry about that. Anyway, Agricola was possibly recalled from his post in Britannia because his real military success on the island cast Domitian's victory in a pretty pathetic light. Not long after Domitian's parade, messengers delivered the news that Agricola had defeated the combined Caledonian army of some 30,000 troops and stood poised to capture the entire island. There is no consensus about whether Agricola was recalled out of jealousy or whether it was more like a reward for 7 years' cold, hard service in the north, but one way or the other, Agricola was back in Rome in 85 AD and effectively retired from public life. His had been one of the more successful careers of the first century, and he very nearly captured the whole of Britannia for the Romans. His work would be left permanently incomplete, though, as the legions he had led were soon transferred to the Danube to help fight the growing Dacian menace, which, unlike the Chatti menace, was all too real. The Dacians lived in the Carpathian Mountains on the far side of the Danube and had been stirring up trouble for years. For the first time in his life, Domitian was about to deal with a real existential threat to the empire. His response to the crisis offered a window into how the emperor really felt about war, defense, and imperial security. Whether he handled the situation properly is a matter of ongoing debate, but there is no doubt that the hawkish aristocracy, already chafing under Domitian, your lord and god, were appalled by his handling of the Dacian situation. The thing about Domitian is that he took Augustus's injunction about further conquest seriously, and really believed that the primary function of the legions was now frontier defense. He didn't want to invade Germania. He didn't want to conquer Dacia. He didn't want anything to do with Scotland. He considered these efforts to be expensive boondoggles that would stretch the legions too thin, cost blood and treasure Rome couldn't afford, and ultimately leave the empire weaker and more vulnerable for the trouble. When it came to military affairs, the great legacy of Domitian was not some new territory added to the empire or some great foreign enemy destroyed, but rather the expansion and strengthening of the Limes Germanicus, the frontier fortification network along the Rhine and Danube rivers that kept the northern empire safe from invasion. Eventually stretching to nearly 350 miles, the fortification network grew to include 60 permanent forts and some 900 watchtowers. Domitian would neither begin the project nor complete it, but he was committed to it wholeheartedly and poured money and manpower into the effort. The key line the Limes Germanicus cut was between the upper Rhine and the upper Danube. While the two great rivers offered a natural defense on their own against unpacified tribes, the stretch of land between the headwaters of each was a dangerous weak point for the empire, and Domitian aimed to close that gap once and for all. Though his work would finally be completed by Hadrian, the time and effort Domitian expended was critical and helped pave the way for a century and a half of security along the northern border. But while Domitian's efforts were critical, they were also criticized. High-ranking military officials and their civilian counterparts believed Domitian far too passive in his military strategy. If the empire was to be safe, it needed to defeat its enemies, not build a wall to keep them out. The fight needed to be taken to the source. It was no good to simply sit back until it was too late. What good was a watchtower if it only alerted Rome to an invasion force too strong to repel? Nascent alliances between barbarian tribes needed to be nipped in the bud before they grew into something truly dangerous. Soldiers were trained to fight, not sit on walls staring into space. It was unnatural. The contrast in style came to a head in Dacia, where each side could reasonably claim the actions of the other detrimental to imperial security. Ever since the Year of the Four Emperors, the tribes beyond the northern frontiers of the Danube had grown more and more bold. The Roman world seemed too preoccupied to care about their raids into imperial territory, and with each passing year the tribes, including the formidable Dacians, acted with increasing impunity. They finally crossed the line and got Rome's attention in either 84 or 85 AD, when a Dacian army invaded Moesia and killed the imperial governor. Hot on the heels of his great victory over the Chatti, Domitian personally led a force to Moesia to deal with the unacceptable affront to Rome's honor. Further signaling how seriously and how personally Domitian was taking the situation, his army included members of the Praetorian Guard and was led by his Praetorian prefect, Cornelius Fuscus. The Roman reinforcements were able to easily drive off the Dacians, who were not about to tangle with an imperial army guided by the emperor himself. By the winter of 85, the Dacians were cleared out of Roman territory, and Domitian returned to Rome to celebrate his second triumph. Though there was still not much to celebrate, this triumph at least had a ring of truth to it, and Domitian was quite pleased with himself for how well his military career was shaping up. But this second triumph proved to be even more of a mockery than the first. The Dacians were not defeated by a long shot, and when Cornelius Fuscus, on his own initiative, crossed the Danube to mop up the remaining combatants, he led his legions to one of their worst defeats since the catastrophe in the Teutoburg forest. In 86 AD, Fuscus led elements of 4 legions plus auxiliaries into Dacian territory, expecting little resistance from the splintered and feuding local tribes. Except that the Dacians weren't splintered and feuding at all. They had been united by a king who was to become known to the Romans as Decebalus, which translates roughly as he with the strength of 10 men. Decebalus saw the Romans coming from a mile away and set an ambush at the narrow pass of Tapi. Fuscus blundered right into the trap. He watched in horror as the entire 5th Legion was cornered and massacred, and then watched in humiliation as the legionary standard of the Praetorian Guard was captured and hauled off by the enemy. Luckily for Fuscus, he did not have to live with the humiliation for long, as he himself was soon killed in the fighting. Back in Rome, the triumph Domitian had celebrated now seemed like a cruel joke. He quickly returned to Moesia to oversee the reinforcement of the province. He divided the territory into 2 administrative districts and transferred 3 legions to boost the defenses along the Danube. Though he was convinced now more than ever that the legions worked best as a defensive force rather than conquering adventurers, Domitian understood that the annihilation of a legion and the capture of a standard, the Praetorian Guard standard no less, could not go unanswered. In both 87 and 88, the Romans crossed the Danube to campaign against Decebalus, though this time they marched with far greater care than had been shown by Fuscus. In 88, the Dacians and Romans once again found themselves facing off at Tapi, though this time the Romans did not stumble blindly into any traps, and Decebalus was soundly beaten. All would seem to be well for Domitian and the Romans. Their honor was restored and the enemy beaten. But unfortunately for Domitian, events elsewhere conspired to turn his victory into a bleeding sore. On January 1st, 89 AD, Lucius Antonius Saturnius, the governor of Upper Germania, had had enough of Domitian and led his 2 legions in revolt. With this sudden crisis on the Rhine, Domitian was forced to conclude a hasty treaty with Decebalus that formally recognized Dacia as a client kingdom of Rome. To ensure that there would be no trouble after he left, Domitian accepted a controversial provision that sent money and artisans to Decebalus in exchange for peace. The money and men would be used by the Dacian king to bolster his own defenses and properly equip his growing army. Domitian's treaty had the effect of transforming Roman tax dollars into Dacian swords and putting Romans to work building walls that later Romans would die trying to climb. The officer corps was already grumbling about Domitian's cowardly obsession with roads and watchtowers, but for him to pay off an enemy like that was borderline dereliction of duty. And they had a point. When Trajan decided to eventually crush Decebalus once and for all, he found the task far more arduous than it should have been, because of all the enemy fortifications built with Roman money. For the record, Decebalus did control lucrative gold mines that bought and paid for most of his army, lucrative gold mines that had far more to do with Trajan's decision to invade than abstract notions of defending Roman honor, by the way. But still, the optics of Domitian's treaty were terrible, and the deal with Decebalus soon became a political wound that refused to heal. Next week, we'll start with the revolt of Saturnius, which would prove to be a turning point in Domitian's reign. Prior to the uprising, Domitian was harsh but fair in his use of imperial power. But afterwards, the emperor would become far more paranoid and far more cruel. Though in the end he would execute for treason no more men than the lovable, huggable Uncle Claudius, the last years of Domitian's reign would nonetheless go down in history as a reign of terror. Eventually, a conspiracy of court officials would determine that they had better kill the emperor before he killed them, and on September 18, 96 AD, Domitian finally met the violent end that he had always suspected would be his to meet. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 77, What Time Is It? Domitian's autocratic reign was approaching the decade mark when it finally ran into some serious blowback. There had been mumblings and grumblings from day one, but thus far, His loyal bureaucracy and his loyal troops had forestalled any major attempts at revolution or coup. But on January 1st, 89 AD, exactly 20 years after Vitellius's revolt along the Rhine, two legions stationed in Upper Germany, led by their provincial governor Lucius Antonius Saturninus, refused to renew their oath to Domitian, and the Roman world once again stood on the brink of civil war. No one had forgotten the horror of 69 AD, and from the outside, Saturninus's revolt looked eerily similar to the Vitellian rebellion. Hadn't Caecina led two legions on the Upper Rhine in revolt? And hadn't that spark been carried down the river until the whole of the Rhine legions stood opposed to the legal emperor in Rome? And hadn't that led to self-destruction on a scale not seen since the days of Octavian and Antony? Yes, he had. Yes, it had. And yes, it did. But this time, things would turn out differently, partly due to the widespread loyalty Domitian had earned from the legions, in contrast to the bitter hatred they had directed at Galba, but also partly due to a heaping shovelful of luck. Had there not been an early thaw, who knows what would have happened. Unfortunately, we're never going to know the full story behind Saturninus's rebellion, but it seems that the governor had been planning his revolt for some time and had probably made contact with like-minded senators back in Rome. We're never going to know because once the uprising was put down by Lapius Maximus, the governor of Lower Germany, who was first on the scene, the victorious governor burned all of Saturninus's correspondence before Domitian arrived. It is likely that the letters implicated all of Saturninus's fellow travelers, and Maximus, having done his duty and put down the revolt, had no wish for the aftermath to turn into a bloodbath. All that we really know is that Saturninus had made some kind of deal with the Chatti, the same Chatti Domitian had used as his triumphal prop 6 years earlier, and the two legions under Saturninus's direct command were supposed to be reinforced by a strong Germanic army to help them make their stand against Domitian. The emperor responded quickly to the crisis, ordering Maximus to take all action necessary to quell the revolt, while he himself led a contingent of Praetorians north to deal with the situation. To help ensure victory, Domitian also ordered a legion from Spain to march in on the double. The legion arrived well after the danger had passed, but the unblinking loyalty of the legion's commander, a one Mr. Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, earned the commander the gratitude of Domitian, who put the man history knows as Trajan on the fast track to his own date with imperial destiny. Saturninus's army was on the Roman side of the Rhine, perhaps stuck on perpetual watchtower duty, which may have helped spurn the restless governor, and his plan was for the Chatti to cross the frozen Rhine before the rest of the Roman world had a chance to react. But the luck of the Flavians returned with a vengeance, and in the middle of January, an unheard-of early thaw turned the stable and thoroughly frozen Rhine River back into a rushing torrent. The Chatti were trapped on the far side, and Saturninus was suddenly left to face the full brunt of imperial reprisal with only two legions at his back. Just 24 days after the revolt began, Saturninus and his legions surrendered to Maximus. As I said, Maximus took the treasonous governor of Upper Germany into custody, and then proceeded to burn the paper trail that had led to the uprising. Who knows what friends, relatives, associates, or otherwise Maximus was protecting, but he certainly did history no favor by destroying all the evidence. The revolt, then, is left as a known, but not very well understood, crisis. Saturninus and his officers were executed, and the two rebellious legions were sent to the front along the Danube. Maximus was awarded the governorship of Syria, and Trajan was elevated to a consulship in 91, followed by key appointments to governorships in Moesia and along the Rhine. I think we all know where his star is headed. The year after the revolt, Domitian decided to serve a term as consul himself, and as his colleague, he made the surprising choice of an influential, but quietly so man, named Marcus Cocceius Nerva. Obviously, serving as the consular colleague of an emperor was incredibly prestigious and not lightly awarded, so scholars have been left to wonder what Nerva did to earn such an honor. Some have speculated that he may have had a hand in uncovering Saturninus's plot, buying the emperor valuable reaction time. After all, Nerva had been instrumental in uncovering the Pisonian conspiracy against Nero the generation before, so maybe the old hand had once again put his ear to the ground and delivered the imperial house from ruin. This probably relies too much on his role in uncovering the earlier conspiracy, in its attempt to say that the consulship was a reward for uncovering the latter conspiracy. And really, we may need to look no further than Nerva's uncanny ability to survive regime change to explain what he was doing at so prominent a position. It takes a man of rare political skill to survive such turbulent times unharmed. Is it really so remarkable that he would one day find himself the consular colleague of an emperor? Or that one day he would simply find himself emperor? Marcus Nerva was born November 8, 30 AD, into an Italian family that had risen to prominence as the Principate was taking shape. His family was not elite Roman nobility, but more and more such distinctions were becoming irrelevant. Vespasian's family was not from Rome proper either, and soon enough the empire would see its first provincial emperor in the aforementioned Trajan. Nerva's grandfather had been a friend of Tiberius and accompanied the emperor to Capri, while his father had risen to the rank of consul under Caligula. Nerva himself eschewed the conventional cursus honorum and seems to have had no interest in a military career, content instead to wield behind-the-scenes political influence as an advisor to the emperor of his own day, Nero. In this capacity, he earned Nero's eternal gratitude for the central role he played in uncovering the Pisonian conspiracy, and the emperor rewarded him with unprecedented triumphal regalia, an honor usually reserved for military victories. While skillfully navigating his way around Nero's imperial court, Nerva at some point ran into Vespasian, and the two struck up a friendship. When Nero committed suicide, I think any reasonable bookmaker would have put Nerva down as a staunch Othonian. Not only was his sister married to Otho's brother, but most of Nero's court wound up in Otho's corner anyway during the civil wars, and Nerva was certainly a member of Nero's court. But Nerva ignored these obvious loyalties and decided early to back Vespasian should the latter heed the calls to enter the ring. This friendship and support allowed Nerva to become one of the few members of Nero's inner circle to transition to the inner circle of the Flavians, which he did so in fine style by being named a consul ordinarii in 71 AD. And that's the prestigious one, remember, that Vespasian usually reserved for members of his own family. Nerva spent the next 2 decades attached at the hip to the Flavian court, acting as a historically undocumented but still powerful member of the regime. Indeed, after his consulship in 71, he doesn't really pop up again until 90 AD, when he is suddenly awarded the honor of serving as Domitian's colleague in the consulship. We'll probably never know what role, if any, Nerva played in uncovering Saturninus's rebellion, or whether it had anything to do with the consular appointment. It could be that after the failed uprising, Domitian wanted to reassert firm control over the empire, and took as his partner the only man he could trust without reservation. A man who had served as an advisor and mentor since Domitian's lonely days in Rome after being left behind when his father and brother went to fight the Jewish war. After the rebellion, Domitian more than ever needed to surround himself with men he could trust. After all, Maximus had taken it upon himself to burn all the evidence in Saturninus's tent before the emperor and his agents could look at it. Who knows what names would have popped up as additional conspirators, or fellow travelers, or officially neutral but secret nod-winkers. As is so often the case after failed assassinations or coups or rebellions, Domitian couldn't help but grow more paranoid and suspicious. Which members of that senatorial delegation are plotting to kill me? Which of my provincial governors are secretly building anti-imperial alliances? How many of my slaves would stab me to death to earn their freedom? Distrustful by nature, Domitian's paranoia accelerated through the 90s AD. He was not blind to what was happening to him, though, nor was he blind to the public's perception that their emperor was jumping at more shadows lately, and with harsher consequences. The problem, as Domitian saw it, was not that he was paranoid for no reason, but that he had every rational right to be paranoid because conspiracies did exist against his life that needed to be uncovered. Suetonius reports that Domitian lamented angrily that no one believes in murderous secret plots against the emperor unless the emperor turns up dead. Domitian was caught in a trap and he knew it. Stay vigilant and be accused of paranoid tyranny, or lighten up and die. A prudent survivor, Domitian decided he could live with the former if it meant that he would live. After the events of 89 AD, then, there was a sharp uptick in treason trials, the old imperial weapon of last resort that had been abandoned by his father and officially outlawed by his brother. It would be neat and clean to say that the revolt caused Domitian to revive the practice, but over the course of his reign, he had already killed a handful of senators for treasonous activities, and his decidedly reactionary take on free speech had dramatically increased the scope of what would be considered treasonous activities. This is why we can only say that the 90s AD saw Domitian's paranoia increase, rather than say that the 90s AD is when it began. In the last 5 years of his reign, though, Domitian killed about 20 men of senatorial rank and confiscated the property of dozens more. Banishments and executions came with disturbing regularity, and it was during this time that Domitian's reputation as a bloodthirsty tyrant was really cemented. To a man, the Senate feared and loathed him. Some were afraid of being falsely accused or being deliberately set up by personal enemies, while others were afraid that their very real attempts to overthrow the emperor were going to be discovered. Domitian, meanwhile, was stuck trying to sort through rumors, innuendo, and vague shreds of evidence, convinced that every day might be his last if he didn't get to them before they got to him. It was, simply put, a bad time all around for everyone. In 96 AD, Domitian finally struck too close to home, and his own court officials turned against him, determining that none of them were safe as long as Domitian remained alive. Supposedly, this last plot was hatched after Domitian executed one of Nero's old freedmen, who had once upon a time helped Nero escape the palace and then helped the outlaw emperor commit suicide. Citing the crime of not doing enough to protect his former master, Domitian had the freedman killed, even though the man had been serving as an imperial secretary for years. The convoluted rationale and cross loyalties in the story cast doubt on how much of this version of events is true, whether or not the man actually returned to imperial service, for example, or really whether Domitian had him killed at all. But his alleged death is cited by Suetonius as the catalyst for Domitian's chamberlain Parthenius to organize an assassination in 96 AD. Most of who knew what remains pure speculation, but the three men we know for sure that were in on the plot were Parthenius himself, his freedman Maximus, and an attendant to one of Domitian's nieces named Stephanus. Maximus was to be the inside man in the palace, making sure that the right doors were locked and the right doors were unlocked, and making sure that on the day of the deed, the sword Domitian kept under his bed would be removed. Stephanus was to be the actual assassination, and in preparation for his attack, he faked an arm injury so everyone would get used to seeing him around with his arm in a sling. With his presence in the palace never suspicious, as he was in the direct employ of the imperial family, and his injured arm now old news to the Praetorians watching over the emperor, Stephanus was able to then hide a dagger in the bandages and come and go as he pleased. The legend then goes that Domitian had long been particularly agitated around noontime, as an astrologer had once told him that that was the time of day that he was destined to die. So he was in the habit of constantly asking what time it was until the hour of his demise passed, so he could relax and go about his business without the fear of death hanging over his head. But on September 18, one of his servants, who was in on the plot, lied to the emperor and told him it was well past noon, when it was in fact just reaching that hour. Content that he was going to live at least one more day, Domitian let down his guard and retired to his personal quarters to sign some paperwork. When Stephanus arrived and demanded an audience with the emperor, claiming that he had uncovered a plot against the emperor's life, Domitian let the boy in to hear what he had to say, unaware that the plot Stephanus was about to reveal was, the one he was planning to execute right then and there. Once he was close enough to the emperor, Stephanus pulled the dagger out of his sling and stabbed Domitian in the groin. But Domitian was not going to be an easy kill, and having survived the initial attack, he managed to fend Stephanus off for several minutes before further accomplices rushed in and overwhelmed the wounded emperor. Suetonius reports that at least 4 other men helped Stephanus inflict 7 fatal stab wounds on Domitian,
who finally collapsed on the floor, dead at the age of 45. The conspirators then hauled the body off and had it cremated without ceremony. The only concession the dead emperor was afforded was that his ashes were eventually deposited in the Flavian temple, rather than simply being scattered to the four winds. He had ruled the empire for 15 dictatorial, but more or less successful years, and would be remembered as a monster. Questions have long abounded about who else was in on the final plan to kill Domitian. Cassius Dio implicates his wife Domitilla, and others have accused the Praetorians of purposeful apathy, if not outright complicity. Further, the Senate's sudden announcement the next day that Nerva, man of the political shadows, was their unanimous choice to serve as the next emperor has raised more than a few ancient and modern eyebrows about his involvement in the plot. I think we can safely say that in their conduct both before and after the assassination, that Domitilla and the rank-and-file Praetorians probably knew nothing of the plot. However, one of the Praetorian prefects, Titus Petronius Secundus, was probably aware of what was unfolding and did nothing to prevent it. But it also seems that he did nothing to bring any of the guardsmen under his command into his confidence. Nerva's involvement is far cloudier, as he shied away from the public eye. He was well connected enough to have eyes and ears everywhere, so it seems reasonable that he may have known something. And the speed with which he was confirmed as heir to the throne suggests that someone may have approached him directly about whether he would be willing to don the purple. But his years of loyalty not just to the Flavians, but to the imperial house in general, seem to belie such suspicions. But then again, he did let all the conspirators go without so much as a slap on the wrist, so who knows? With Nerva in place, the Senate then let 15 years of simmering anger explode in a series of edicts officially damning Domitian's memory. His name was taken off all the public monuments and buildings he had constructed over the years, and statues or reliefs that bore his likeness were recarved to look like Nerva. The goal was to pretend as if Domitian never happened, just as Augustus had once tried to pretend that Mark Antony had never happened. But the law banishing Domitian from the collective memory worked no better than it had for Augustus, and even in Rome itself, it was difficult to keep everyone on the same revisionist page. Out in the province, it was an utter impossibility, and in the legions, it was downright dangerous to even suggest it. The rank and file still loved Domitian, and they screamed for blood when his murder was announced. When the assassins were let go, they howled for vengeance, and for the entirety of his brief reign, Nerva would have difficulty exerting any kind of real influence on the troops for having allowed such a betrayal. Next week, things will get so bad for Nerva that the Praetorians will actually besiege the palace and take him hostage, demanding, among other things, the literal heads of Domitian's assassins. As I've said a few times, Domitian wanted to usher in nothing less than an Augustan Renaissance, and during his time in office, he certainly matched the breadth and depth of the first emperor's interests. Just as with Augustus, Domitian did not limit himself to war and politics. To both of them, the influence of the princeps rightly extended into all aspects of Roman life: the economy, culture, the arts, morality, and sexuality. Domitian attempted to follow the blueprint laid down by Augustus. After all, it had worked out great the first time around. But unfortunately, he never did have the personal gravitas to pull it off. Romans of all stripes had scoffed when Augustus tried to implement his conservative morality laws. The reception when Domitian tried to revive them was a healthy belly laugh. When Augustus put his foot down after the disaster in the Teutoburg and declared an end to Roman expansion and a reorganization of the legions into a defensive force, his commanders obeyed. Augustus's military credentials were, after all, impeccable. But when the more or less civilian Domitian hewed the identical line, he was accused of cowardice, dereliction of duty, and worse. He had done nothing to earn the respect of his officers, and generals openly vented their frustrations, even though, had the order come from Augustus, they would have hopped to without question. Augustus was able to do much because he was Augustus, and Domitian's difficulties stand as living proof of the first emperor's unique talents. Domitian forever battled on, but his Augustan Renaissance was doomed to failure as long as Augustus himself was not around to make it work. Next week, we'll begin the smooth transition from the Flavian dynasty to the so-called Nervan Antonine dynasty, which will control Rome until the assassination of Commodus nearly a century hence. This new dynasty will be populated by the men Gibbon famously dubbed the Five Good Emperors, and during their time on the throne, the empire will reach its peak culturally, economically, and geographically. In addition to their own unique talents, the Five Good Emperors are collectively remembered for the wisdom they showed in picking their successors. Rather than relying on their own possibly deficient biological sons, they chose to adopt men of merit who would rule the empire as well as they had. The example they set in this regard is often lauded as basically the pinnacle of enlightened politics and noble sacrifice in the name of civic virtue. The only problem with this is that until Marcus Aurelius, none of the emperors of the Nervan Antonine dynasty actually had biological sons to pass power onto. Nerva had to adopt Trajan, who had to adopt Hadrian, who had to adopt Antonius Pius, who had to adopt Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, because between them there was not a biological son to be found. So while it was a remarkable run of capable men, and they all deserve credit for their eventual choices and heirs, we should not pretend that they were purposefully refusing to hand power to their biological heirs. The first chance one of them had to pass the throne on to a son took it, and that decision is where Gibbon finally landed in his search for the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire. The last thing I'll mention before I go is that I recently recorded a short interview about the history of Rome for BBC 5 Radio's Pods and Blogs series that should be airing this Tuesday night. If you're interested, I've posted a link to the interview at thehistoryofrome.typepad.com, but you can also get the episode on iTunes by searching for Pods and Blogs. I will note, however, that I haven't actually heard the final cut of the interview, so if it turns out that I sound like a damn fool, then I'm going to erase the link and deny the whole thing ever happened. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 78, Imperial Stopgap. The assassination of Domitian threatened to bring the Flavian dynasty full circle. Political chaos and its bosom buddies, violence, destruction, and death, had brought the family to power 25 years before, and now, with no heir to speak of, the sudden murder of the emperor stood ready to open the door to another round of bitter civil war. But no one had forgotten the horrors of 68 and 69 AD, least of all the Senate, and the elites in Rome moved quickly to find someone, anyone to rally behind before the provincial general started dreaming imperial dreams. But finding the perfect candidate would not be easy. Preferably, he would be an ally of the Flavians, so it could be plausibly argued that the new emperor did not necessarily represent a break with the previous dynasty. He should also be an older man, so that if, in their haste to find a successor, they picked a bad one, at least they would not have to live with their mistake for long. And if they could scrounge up a childless old man, that would be best of all. Everyone agreed that finding an emperor now was the most important thing, and that unanimity was needed to make the choice stick. But unanimity now could be achieved best if every senator could imagine that his own preferred candidate would eventually be adopted by whatever old childless man they brought in now. Finally, since they had just chafed for a decade and a half under Domitian, it would be best if they brought in a man without strong military credentials or an independent political base. The Senate wanted back in the game, and they weren't going to get back in if they brought in someone who could just go right back to ignoring them. All of these parameters were cross-triangulated, and the man whose name popped up was longtime imperial advisor Marcus Nerva. Past 60, the staunch Flavian was old enough not to last too long on the throne, had no sons to pass power on to when he died, had spent his life avoiding the political limelight, and had no military record to speak of. He was the perfect stopgap answer to the question of succession. Nerva would buy the political establishment time to work through their rivalries and alliances peacefully, without needing to resort to violence. Nerva had never even hinted that he wanted the job, but he too remembered the year of the 4 emperors. Within hours of Domitian's death, he accepted the Senate's acclaim. If it meant keeping the peace, the man who had spent his life in the shadows was more than willing to step into the light. At this point, the Senate was quite pleased with itself. They had just fired their first shot in a bid to emerge from the political wilderness, and it felt good. Since the dawn of the Principate, their role in the succession process had always been to rubber stamp decisions that had already been made, whether by the previous emperor, the Praetorian Guard, or the legions in the field. For the first time, the Senate, all on its own, was choosing the man who would rule the empire. The reign of Domitian was unquestionably the nadir of senatorial power, and now that he was dead, they believed that they were rapidly approaching a new zenith. In his initial pronouncements, Nerva did not disappoint on this front. He declared an end to treason trials and promised a blanket moratorium on executions of men of senatorial rank. He freed Domitian's political prisoners, returned confiscated property, and recalled dozens from exile. Having undone much of Domitian's damage, Nerva then went further and vowed to bring the Senate back into the political fold. They would no longer be a social club without purpose or responsibility. Nerva promised them active participation in his administration. The Senate, to say the least, was flying high. But all was not well in the empire as a whole. The Senate had never been a good barometer of anything other than what extremely rich men in Rome thought about things. It was a sure bet that if a man was the Senate's preferred candidate, then he was going to run into difficulties elsewhere. And indeed, all the things that recommended Nerva to the Senate caused him problems everywhere else during his 16 months in power. Being old and childless was not necessarily a problem, but his total lack of military experience and the fact that the public at large had no idea who the heck he was, yeah, those things were going to come back to haunt him. Political power is a zero-sum game, so while the Senate gloried in having chosen Domitian's successor, the 2 other institutions that had grown accustomed to having the final word on such matters, the Praetorian Guard and the provincial legions, developed quick and healthy grudges at having been left out of the process. Nerva then exacerbated the situation by letting Domitian's killers go free, a move that the Senate applauded but the troops hated. When Domitian's loyal soldiers heard the news that the only punishment handed out was the dismissal of Secundus as Praetorian prefect, they couldn't believe their ears. Nerva attempted to placate them with a generous donative upon ascending to the throne, issued to both the Praetorians and the rank-and-file soldiers, but it was not nearly enough to dampen their outrage. Here was some random, probably corrupt, puppet of the Senate thinking he can just murder our emperor and then drop a few coins around and make everything all better. Who the hell did this guy think he was? Does he even know which end of a sword to hold? For the rest of his short reign, Nerva would barely even try to exert influence over the legions, and his relationship with the army could never be described as anything better than strained. The new emperor did somewhat better with the public at large, but his quest for popularity led the empire into shaky financial territory that would only really be resolved by the sound policies of Trajan, who was a firm believer in the seize your neighbor's massive gold and silver deposits to pay for everything school of economics. It wasn't that Nerva started out as some delusional tax cut and spend executive, but eventually that's where his policies took him. He wanted to ease the heavy tax burden Domitian had saddled the empire with, while simultaneously expanding social welfare programs, which, doesn't usually add up to fiscal success. For a man who was not exactly known outside the halls of the imperial palace, Nerva was acutely aware of the need to generate some goodwill, and fast, and he kicked things off in fine style by announcing a one-time bonus payment of 75 denarii per citizen to celebrate his ascension to the throne. He then went further and began using imperial money and property to extend land grants to the poor and lower middle class. Then, over the course of his first year in office, he tried to alleviate the heavy financial burdens Domitian had laid upon them all by exempting rich and poor alike from various tax schemes Domitian had dreamed up. Everyone was starting to dig the new guy. Lower taxes and more stuff is definitely a recipe for political popularity, and Nerva was just getting started. But the new emperor also understood that lower taxes and more stuff is not just a recipe for political success, it is also a recipe for economic disaster, and he at least tried to get some of his new programs to pay for themselves. The program closest to his heart was a new, stable welfare program for the poorest of the poor. Previous emperors had issued free grain allotments, but these programs were started and stopped at will, leaving a level of social insecurity that Nerva wanted to end for good. Plus, he figured if he could entrench his new alimentary system into the fabric of society, then his legacy would be secured. But after all the tax cutting, the treasury was running low, so Nerva decided to get into the business of issuing loans for land purchases in Italy. What does that have to do with a social welfare program? Well, in addition to encouraging greater land ownership, men who took out loans from the state were required to pay 5% interest directly back to their local municipalities, payments that would underwrite Nerva's new welfare system. But in the end, Nerva was adding too much to the debit side of the ledger without making up for it on the credit side, and within a year, the fiscal situation looked grim. So Nerva and the Senate turned to the politician's best friend for dealing with one's own policy blunders. They formed a blue ribbon commission to study the problem and make recommendations. But the commission turned out to be more than simply an instrument of public relations, and it actually came back with some effective ways to cut costs and raise revenues. For one thing, they reported, Domitian had inaugurated myriad games and banquets and festivals, all designed to foster public goodwill and show off the recently completed Colosseum in all its glory. He was able to pay for it all because he was taxing the dickens out of everyone, but when Nerva shut down Domitian's various revenue streams, the games became a black hole for imperial money. The commission recommended severely limiting Domitian's festival calendar down to the necessary religious observances, and Nerva immediately took their advice. The commission also noted that in addition to the mounds of bejeweled riches he hoarded in the palace, Domitian had also been in the habit of building marvelous solid gold and silver statues of himself. Does the empire really need gold statues of Domitian laying around, or do you suppose we could melt them down and put all that gold and silver to better use? Turning the old statues into coins only got the emperor so far, though, so Nerva then held public auctions to purge the palace of Domitian's treasure. Finally, they raised enough money to get the empire's financial situation back on track, at least temporarily. But of course, canceling games and melting down statues are one-time only fixes, which would have been a problem for Nerva had he been in office any longer. But by the time the bill came due again, he was dead. An economic crisis invented and resolved, Nerva breathed a sigh of relief. It is easy to feel a bit sorry for the old man. He had spent his life behind the scenes, offering advice, helping to find problems, and running small meetings. At no point had he been the man making the decisions, or the man who had to deal with the political backlash when things went awry, or the man who was expected to control the herd of cats that was the Roman Senate. For example, having promised the Senate that they were essentially exempt from political punishment, he placed no restrictions on their own pursuit of political vendettas, and the body quickly turned on itself in a maelstrom of accusations and counter-accusations over past offenses. Unwilling to come down hard on the one part of the political system who really supported him, Nerva allowed the Senate to run amok, prompting one member to observe that the tyranny of Domitian was perhaps superior to the anarchy of Nerva. The emperor simply did not have a firm executive mindset, and soon everyone, friends included, came to see him as weak and ineffective. He was, at his core essence, simply unsuited for the job of emperor. When a coup masterminded by a senator named Calpurnius Crassus was exposed, and Nerva refused to execute the plotters. It was not seen as a generous act of forgiveness in the mold of Julius Caesar. It was instead seen as the lame response of a weak man who refused to stand up even for himself. For the Praetorians, who had been ticked off since Nerva refused to properly punish Domitian's assassins, the situation was fast becoming untenable. In late 97 AD, after just over a year in office, old resentments were finally combined with enough new resentments to trigger a revolt among the guardsmen. Nerva had never been their choice, and in the past year he had done nothing to show them that he was anything but a spineless puppet of the Senate. But they were not interested in hacking their emperor to pieces, at least not yet, as he was obviously not a madman like Caligula or Nero. Mostly, they just wanted to remind him that the Senate may have placed him on the throne, but the Praetorians kept him there. It was important for Nerva to understand that whoever said that the pen was mightier than the sword had clearly never been stabbed to death in the middle of the night. So in October of 97, led by their new prefect Casperius Aelianus, the man appointed by Nerva to replace the dismissed Secundus, the Praetorians laid siege to the imperial palace and, quickly breaching the meager, non-Praetorian defenses, took the emperor hostage. Nerva quickly gave in to their demand that Domitian's killers finally be brought to justice, and in short order, Parthenius, Secundus, and the other conspirators were hunted down and executed. The emperor also wound up publicly thanking the Praetorians for reminding him of his duty, which was a part of the deal that sent them back to their barracks. The details of what else they wanted is hard to figure, but that was never the point. The point was to remind the emperor who was alpha dog in Rome. It wasn't important what the Praetorians demanded. It was only important that the emperor comply. After this unsettling ordeal, Nerva knew that he needed to do something fast to salvage his decimated reputation. Not just for his own sake, but for the whole empire. He did not have the support of the legions, and the Praetorians had just publicly humiliated him. His only real political allies were in the Senate, and, well, nobody liked them anyway. Nerva knew that conditions like these can lead quickly to civil war if they are not headed off at the pass. Up until now, the old and childless Nerva had been coy about who he planned to name as his successor. He had been flirting with the idea of adopting as his heir the governor of Syria, but in the aftermath of the Praetorian siege, he changed course and suddenly announced to everyone's delight, the legions most of all, that he was adopting as his heir the most popular general of the day, Trajan. Immediately, the political waters that had been heating up to a full boil cooled. Any hint of open revolt or civil war disappeared almost overnight. The only group put out by the choice of Trajan was the Senate, as they had hoped to be in the driver's seat on the issue of succession. As I said, every senator had their favorite candidate, and they were all getting ready for some good old-fashioned horse trading to get their preferred man in place, when Nerva up and killed the game before it ever got started. In time, though, they would shed whatever resentment they had over being bypassed, as Trajan proved himself to be an emperor as great as the divine Augustus himself. The future Emperor Trajan was born in Spain in 53 AD, near modern-day Seville. This, of course, made him what no previous emperor had ever been, a provincial. Now, it is a matter of some dispute whether Trajan was technically a provincial, or whether he was the member of a displaced Roman family that had moved into the region following Rome's envelopment of the Iberian Peninsula. The argument boils down to whether you believe Trajan's branch of the extended Ulpian family was pure Italian, or whether it had been native Spanish and adopted into the clan at some point in the past. Which, yeah, I'm not going to get bogged down in, since it doesn't really matter how pure Trajan's blood was when pointing out that he was the first provincial emperor, because every single citizen of the empire, Italian and provincial alike, considered him provincial. Full stop. His family rose to prominence with the Flavians, and Trajan's father was elevated to senatorial status, following his loyal service to Vespasian and Titus during the Jewish War. The high regard Vespasian had for Trajan's father is amply demonstrated by the former's appointment in 76 AD to the governorship of Syria. Trajan accompanied his father and got his first taste of public service in military life, serving as a tribune in the Eastern legions. Shortly after his stint in the Syrian army, young Trajan was granted a quaestorship, and his rapid rise up the cursus honorum was underway. His public career well begun, Trajan then managed to marry a woman who would go down in history as one of the finest matrons in the whole long history of the empire, Pompeia Plotina. Roman writers typically cast their women either as reserved, saintly mothers in the Cornelia Africana mold, or as diabolical stepmothers in the Livia Agrippina mold. The difference in depiction, unfortunately, usually came down to how much power the woman in question wielded. If the answer was a lot, then you can bet she was going to be portrayed as a scheming, probably murderous old witch. Pompeia Plotina, however, managed to avoid this fate and somehow got the old historians to fit the notion of a capable and influential woman having a positive impact on the world around her into their heads. And that alone should prove what an impressive woman she actually was. Trajan became praetor in or around 85 AD, and shortly thereafter found himself leading the 7th Legion stationed in Spain. Trajan was a natural leader and excelled at the art of war, and it was clear that his star was on the rise. He had the kind of easygoing authority that made men not just ready to serve, but eager to serve. He had a relaxed, familiar relationship with his troops that, coupled with his policy of strict but fair discipline, reminds you of no one so much as Julius Caesar. The young provincial general was fast becoming the most popular man in the Roman army. Coming to the aid of Domitian so readily during Saturninus's revolt earned him Domitian's gratitude, and with his natural talents now joined with imperial favor, he was off to the races. In 91 AD, he served a term as consul, followed by key appointments as governor in Moesia and Upper Germany. As governor, he earned rave reviews not just for his military acumen, but for his administrative skills. As a provincial himself, he brought along with him none of the arrogant disdain the boys raised on the Palatine Hill seemed to carry around with them as they arrived in wherever to serve their perfunctory proconsulships. As emperor, Trajan brought this worldview with him, fully recognizing that the empire he ruled was not a collection of faceless conquered people led by a divinely ordained elite in Rome, but rather a collection of unique and talented peoples who were all contributing to the greatness of the empire to which they belonged. It was a worldview that would serve Trajan and the Roman Empire as a whole quite well. Through the mess of Domitian's assassination and Nerva's ascension, Trajan did his best to keep his troops in line and loyal to the legal emperor. But he was not oblivious to their unhappiness with the situation, nor their whispered calls that perhaps he ought to be sitting on the throne instead of shifty old Nerva. But before he had a chance to really be persuaded that he ought to, take matters into his own hand, the Praetorian revolt made the whole question moot. Knowing full well that Trajan was the most popular man in the army, and that he needed the army on his side if he hoped to remain on the throne, Nerva suddenly announced his intention to adopt Trajan and make him his heir. Elevated to the consulship for 98 AD and given a full share of the emperor's tribunician powers, Trajan suddenly found himself not just heir, but practically co-emperor. There is some speculation that with Trajan in place and well received, that Nerva was planning to abdicate the throne, but we'll never know for sure because in January 98 AD, Nerva died of an illness at the age of 67 after just 16 months in office. Trajan was in Germany when Nerva died, and it is traditionally reported that it was young Hadrian, future emperor himself, who delivered the news that Trajan was now the sole emperor of the Roman Empire. Nerva's reign had been brief and stormy, and in the end we should probably be talking about the 4 good emperors rather than the 5 good emperors. But as a temporary stopgap to fend off civil war, he did just fine. His alimentary system did entrench itself as a cornerstone of the enlightened despotism that defined his successors, and whatever damage his economic flailing did was short-lived as Trajan soon solved the empire's money problems. So Nerva's personal legacy was a mixed bag that did some long-term good, but no real long-term damage. But of course, he will always be remembered as one of the 5 good emperors, because his chosen heir turned out to be Trajan, who was consistently ranked either second or third, depending on what you think of Constantine, on the list of greatest emperors of all time. So Nerva stuck the landing on the most critical decision of his reign, and for that alone, we shouldn't kick him around too much. When we come back, we'll begin the reign of Trajan, who, as I said, is widely considered one of the best emperors in Roman history. A military man at heart, he would leave Augustus's injunction against further expansion in the dust and push the empire into heretofore unconquered territory, bringing back with him riches that would fund a century of Roman brilliance. As a result of his campaigns, practically every standard map of the Roman Empire you see today is labeled down in the corner, Roman Empire at its greatest extent, 117 AD, or something like that. That was Trajan. He was Rome at its greatest extent. However, I must tell you that Trajan will have to wait until after the new year. I'm taking 2 weeks off for the holidays, but we'll be back on January 10 to begin the century Gibbon famously called the period when the condition of the human race was at its happiest and most prosperous. Happy Saturnalia. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 79, The Dacian Wars. When Nerva died in January of 98 AD, news of his death generated as much relief as it did sadness. We know from last time that Nerva was no egomaniacal, despotic monster whose death was eagerly anticipated by friend and foe alike, but neither was he seen as the best man for a very difficult job. The best man, everyone agreed, was Trajan, and from the minute he had been adopted, the death watch began on Nerva. The sooner the old emperor died, the sooner imperial authority would be back in the hands of a man who would know how to use it properly. So when Nerva slipped his mortal coil, just months after naming Trajan heir, everyone agreed how nice it was that the old man had not dragged things out. Rome would again be ruled by a proper emperor, not a political fixer in over his head. The crazy thing about Trajan is that in his almost 20 years in office, he actually managed to exceed the high expectations everyone had for him. And after his death, every subsequent emperor would ascend to the throne blessed by the ceremonial prayer, "May he be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan." There was no drama surrounding the succession, as he had already been entrusted with most of the important powers that collectively made up official imperial authority. In the few months between his adoption and Nerva's death, the two men resembled colleagues far more than they resembled present ruler and future heir. As I mentioned last time, there is even some speculation that Nerva was planning to abdicate the throne as soon as Trajan was settled into his new position, but died before he had the chance to. Some wanted Trajan to take over completely right away, but the general declined to even return to Rome during the brief time he and Nerva shared power. Perhaps it was just that he was too busy monitoring the situation on the Rhine, but it could also be that he understood all too well that he would utterly overshadow Nerva should he return to the capital, and out of professional courtesy, he stayed away to let Nerva serve out his term with honor. I would believe either explanation, but his well-documented political humility and respect for the pride of proud men makes the latter an enticing conclusion. But then again, he would be emperor in his own right for more than a year before he finally did make his way to Rome, so it could be that he really was just too busy ensuring the security of the northern border to come back to the capital for some speeches and religious ceremonies. Careful attention to the real responsibilities of office, as opposed to the lavish trappings of power, was another of Trajan's character traits that endear him to everyone, ancient, medieval, and modern alike. Like I said, Trajan spent most of his first year in office traveling the empire's frontier, first along the Rhine and then the Danube. Mostly satisfied with the defensive fortifications Domitian had put in place, Trajan eventually arrived in Moesia, the province opposite the kingdom of Dacia, where he paused, studied, and concluded that war north of the Danube was inevitable. As a career military man, he was well aware of the fury among his peers at the peace treaty Domitian had signed with Decebalus, and now the new emperor was witnessing firsthand the fruits of that poison tree. The money and material Domitian had sent to Decebalus was supposed to be used to bolster the Dacian border facing away from Rome, to help the new client king fulfill his responsibility as a buffer against the uncivilized tribes beyond the frontier. But Trajan's scouts reported back to him that Decebalus had actually built a substantial fortification network facing south, towards the Roman provinces. The implication of this fortification network was all too clear. Decebalus was clearly anticipating future hostilities with Rome. The only question was when the next war would break out. But Trajan was a patient man. While he immediately apprehended that he was, at some point, going to invade Dacia, he knew that he couldn't just go flying off half-cocked. While the situation in Dacia was going to come to a head eventually, it did not look ready to explode just yet. Undertaking an invasion on the scale he envisioned was going to take careful planning, but most of all, it was going to take a solidified political position at home. He was popular now, the new car smell still lingering in the air, but Trajan understood how quickly novelty can wear off. Without the support of the people and the Senate back home, it was pure folly to go off conquering abroad. So, bidding an until next time to the Dacian kingdom, he made his way back to Rome in 99 AD. His arrival in the capital was as magnificent as any triumphal procession. His return to Rome had been anticipated since Nerva had named him heir, and the whole population of the city turned out to cheer their new emperor. Setting the tone for his reign, Trajan did not ride in on a splendid chariot or atop a great steed. Instead, he entered the city on foot and walked down the streets, greeting his adoring subjects. He continued in this vein as he met with the Senate, adopting a deferential tone and vowing to continue Nerva's policy that left men of senatorial rank free from the fear of imperial persecution. The Senate had been unhappy that they had had no say in the adoption of Trajan, and even more unhappy that he was a mere Spanish provincial. But the new emperor's demeanor disarmed even his most pessimistic critics. In both word and deed, Trajan signaled that he was returning to the old Augustan model of the emperor's princeps, merely the first among equals. This went a long way towards assuaging the doubts of the aristocracy, who quickly came to view Trajan as not only a man they could work with, but also a man who would work with them. Indeed, Trajan wound up as a sort of ironic flip side to Domitian. Domitian had sought to emulate all of Augustus's ends while ignoring the first emperor's means. Trajan, meanwhile, emulated Augustus's means while, as we will soon see, pursuing his own very different ends. Trajan spent the next 2 years in Rome solidifying his position, always with one eye on Dacia, but otherwise focused on ensuring political and economic peace across the empire he now commanded. To gain the support of the Senate, he freed more of Domitian's old political prisoners and returned more confiscated property to the aristocratic victims of the last Flavian's regime. To gain the support of the people, he announced his intention to continue and extend Nerva's alimentary system, and then ensure that his stepfather would receive proper deification from the Senate for the good work he had done in service to the empire. He then set about systematically reducing the size and scope of the imperial court. Domitian had built an executive branch that commanded and controlled the goings-on of the whole empire. Trajan had no interest in acting as an omniscient central authority, and let it be known that in the future he would rely on the sound judgment of his provincial governors to decide for themselves how to handle their territories. He would issue orders on the most important or dangerous issues, but other than that, requests for instructions were usually returned with a note telling the governor, politely, to figure it out for himself. Trajan's bottom line was that you know the people and specific circumstances of your province best, and I have no intention of micromanaging you from Rome. Of course, Trajan had no intention of micromanaging from Rome because he planned to be busy with other, more important things. like, for example, the conquest of Dacia. The whole time he was busy solidifying his political position, he was simultaneously focused on redeploying the legions to ensure the success of his planned campaign. In addition to raising 2 new legions, he reorganized who was stationed where to ensure that when he marched across the Danube, border security would not suffer because of the troops he had pulled away from their previous posts. He also put his men to work expanding and strengthening the road network south of the Danube to ensure the stability of his supply lines. There's an old maxim that amateurs think about strategy while professionals think about logistics. If this is true, then Trajan was a consummate professional. His wars in Dacia would become legendary not for the battle plans he drew up, but for the engineering feats he employed to make the campaigns possible. Not since Caesar had built his bridges across the Rhine had the ancient world seen military engineering the likes of which Trajan demanded. Leading the emperor's corps of engineers was a key lieutenant who would eventually go down as one of the greatest architects in history, Apollodorus of Damascus. The Greek-born native of Syria at some point came to the attention of Trajan, and when the latter became emperor, he brought Apollodorus in as his chief architect, builder, and sculptor. Over the course of his reign, if Trajan needed something built, a bridge, a road, a triumphal arch, a new forum for Rome, another triumphal arch, he always turned to Apollodorus, who fulfilled his emperor's requests with what would eventually become world-famous vision and skill. The stone bridge he would soon build across the Danube would not only be the first permanent bridge across that great river, but also stand as the longest bridge ever built by humans for over 1,000 years. But before he could display his skills, he needed the opportunity to use them, and in 101, Trajan was ready to create the opportunity they both needed to achieve everlasting fame. Satisfied that the empire was in good working order, and the legions were in place to prosecute and support his invasion of Dacia, Trajan went to the Senate and asked for their permission to invade. He didn't need to do this, obviously, but he thought it prudent and beneficial to let the Senate give their seal of approval to his plans. Gratified by the deference they had been shown thus far, and the respect they were being shown now, the Senate overwhelmingly supported Trajan and gave him their firm blessing to go out a-conquerin'. The emperor traveled to Moesia to take personal command of the 4-legion-strong invasion force, and in March 101, crossing a temporary but still impressive bridge Apollodorus had built across the Danube, he led his legions into Dacia. Fully cognizant of the trap Cornelius Fuscus had blundered into by advancing too quickly, Trajan took his time moving north, fully scouting and securing each territory before moving in. Decebalus had been waiting for years for the Romans to invade, and was eager to test out his new defensive network. If he could repel Trajan, his renown would grow, and he would be able to possibly cobble together a kingdom strong enough to stand against the Romans not just temporarily, but forever. Trajan, though, was an altogether different animal from the mediocre generals Domitian had sent previously, and rather than eternal renown, Decebalus would go down in history as just another barbarian king bested by the might of Rome. The first phase of the war, though, went well for the Dacians, in that it resulted in something of a stalemate. Once again, a battle was fought at the fortress guarding the pass at Tapi, a hard-fought affair that saw Trajan endure losses far in excess of anything he was expecting. The Romans technically won the battle, but only because the Dacians withdrew from the field after a sudden storm kicked up, rather than because they were beaten militarily. Somewhat shocked at the cost of his Pyrrhic victory, Trajan came down out of the mountains before winter began and withdrew to the Roman side of the Danube to regroup. This was going to be harder than he thought. Still doable, but his men needed to rest and recuperate before they could be expected to finish the job. Over the winter of 101-102, though, the Romans were unexpectedly called back into action. Believing that he had the Romans on the run, Decebalus decided to go on the offensive, and he led his army across the frozen Danube to raid Moesia and further demoralize the battered legions. But Decebalus's offensive got off to a rocky start when cracks in the ice swallowed a portion of his army before they had a chance to inflict any damage on the Romans at all. Now themselves demoralized, the Dacians were easily driven home by the quickly mobilized Roman response. In the spring of 102, Trajan was determined to press all the way to the Dacian capital and remind Decebalus that he was no equal of the Roman Empire. But after the previous winter's folly and the pretty obvious reality that Trajan meant serious business, Decebalus decided to take the wind out of Trajan's invasion by offering his surrender. This year's fighting had only seen a few brief skirmishes, but these were bloody and difficult affairs, and Trajan decided it may be in everyone's best interest for the Romans to accept Decebalus' surrender and renegotiate the terms of the peace. After all, it was not the fact that Dacia remained independent that was the problem. It was the fact that Decebalus had remained hostile after officially accepting an alliance with Rome. So Trajan imposed far harsher terms than Domitian had outlined, ordering Decebalus to cede a portion of his kingdom to Rome, tear down the walls of his various fortresses, and dismantle the defensive war machines that lined the mountain passes. Decebalus made a great show of accepting the terms, and it seemed, at least for the moment, that the Dacian question had been answered. It was enough of an answer for Trajan anyway, that the emperor returned to Rome and celebrated a triumph. But after his experience with Domitian, Decebalus viewed surrendering to the Romans as little more than a way to buy time and possibly scam money and material out of the empire. The Romans had left him alone to siphon funds for a decade before they caught wise to him before, and the Dacian king saw no reason why this latest surrender should be any different. So he once again pledged to fortify the borders of Dacia facing away from the Romans if Trajan directed appropriate funds his way. Perhaps convinced that the chastised king had learned his lesson, Trajan sent along money and men to help cement the renewed alliance between Rome and Dacia. But the emperor was not totally oblivious to the duplicity of Decebalus, and in the years after his first campaign in Dacia, he had Apollodorus build a permanent bridge across the Danube in case the Romans needed to reinvade. Over 1,100 meters long, 15 meters wide, and 19 meters tall, Trajan's bridge, as it would come to be known, was one of the most impressive engineering marvels of the ancient world. Guarded on both sides by fortified guardhouses and perched atop 20 stone columns sunk into the riverbed, the bridge would stand as a monument to Roman power for almost 200 years, until the Emperor Aurelian demolished it as he attempted to re-solidify the empire during the dark days of the 3rd century. Trajan no doubt hoped the bridge would help deter some of Decebalus' hostility, in a, we can come at you whenever we want, so why don't you just chill out sort of way. But the Dacian king proved as obstinate as ever, and in 105, Trajan once again was preparing for war. This time, the problem was that Decebalus was inciting local tribes to invade Roman territory and promising to support their efforts to undermine the Romans south of the Danube. Fed up completely with the unrepentant king, Trajan readied the legions for a second invasion. This time, he was not aiming for anything less than the complete destruction of Decebalus and the annexation of Dacia into the empire as a conquered province. In the spring of 106, Trajan ordered 3 columns into Dacia to overwhelm the kingdom. The bulk of each of the 3 columns drove from different directions straight at the Dacian capital, but small detachments were fanned out across the country to secure key points and generally smother any resistance that might pop up in the eventually occupied country. Trajan led one of the columns to the capital himself, and once everyone arrived, he ordered a full frontal assault on the city. However, even though Decebalus was facing down the Romans with a skeleton defense force, the Dacians held off the assault, and the Romans were forced to break off the attack. Seeing that brute force would not work, Trajan turned to cunning. Noticing that the capital received all of its clean water from a network of aqueduct pipes, he sent his men around to destroy them all and cut the Dacians off from their water. As soon as the water stopped flowing, it was only a matter of time before the Dacians surrendered, and soon enough they raised the white flag and allowed the Romans to enter the gates. Decebalus and his family fled before his capital surrendered, but were soon tracked by a Roman cavalry unit and pinned down. Knowing what happened to captured enemies of Rome, especially captured leaders, Decebalus committed suicide rather than fall into Roman hands. His head was delivered to Trajan, and the emperor sent it back to Rome to be put on display. He then ordered the Dacian capital demolished, and a new capital, a Roman provincial capital, built some 40 kilometers away. Dacia was formally annexed by the Romans, and it became the last major province added to the empire. Trajan would of course add much more territory to the empire before his death in 117 AD, but Hadrian would immediately abandon his predecessor's eastern conquest. Dacia, though, would remain the empire until Aurelian abandoned the territory in the 270s AD. The conquest of Dacia was not just a military feather in Trajan's cap. It would also prove to be a huge boon to the Roman economy. Dacia contained some of the best gold mines in the ancient world, and for years, the Romans would be able to rely on the steady stream of precious metal coming in from Dacia to fund all of their dreams. Trajan received a down payment on future riches when a Dacian general betrayed the location of Decebalus's well-stocked treasure house. When the emperor returned to Rome, he carted back with him riches not seen since the day Pompey returned from the east some 170 years before, and in a stroke, the financial problems Nerva had wrestled with were slayed. There was now more than enough money not only to pay for all previously incurred expenses and promises, but also to fund a whole host of new projects. And with the help of Apollodorus, Trajan would see that the money was put to good use. The most famous product of the Dacian treasure trove was the new forum complex Apollodorus designed and built to help alleviate the burden of Rome's overcrowded public spaces. Built just north of the main forum, the massive new space, which would become known as Trajan's Forum, required the leveling of parts of the Quirinial and Capitoline hills, a huge undertaking in its own right that had been on the imperial to-do list since the days of Augustus. Trajan's new forum would be formally inaugurated in 112 AD, greatly enhancing the day-to-day economic life of Rome. The next year, Apollodorus would complete the most famous part of the most famous product of the Dacian treasure trove, and in 113, Trajan's Column, the triumphal sculpture commemorating Trajan's victory, was unveiled. Rising over 100 feet off the ground, the freestanding column is wrapped 23 times by 600 feet of frieze sculpture telling the story of Trajan's campaigns. The column stands today in Rome, and in addition to simply being a marvel to behold, it also serves as a living record of Trajan's activities in Dacia. Indeed, much of what we know about these wars, and much of what you have just heard, is directly sourced to the column, with all the attendant caveats about the danger of relying too much on imperial propaganda, which the column most assuredly was. Had he simply stopped there, Dacia conquered, and the infrastructure of the empire receiving a much-needed upgrade, Trajan would already be going down as one of the most successful emperors in history. But he was not done yet. Next week, Trajan will turn his attention to the east and really flip Augustus's injunction against further expansion on its head. Though in the end his conquest would prove fleeting, Trajan's campaigns in the east would give the Romans one last glorious adventure to cheer on before they settled in to their nice, long, slow decline. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 80, Optimus Trajan. As I said at the end of last week's episode, had Trajan died after his first decade in office, he probably would have been viewed by history as a highly successful emperor. When he took power, the empire was still a bit hungover from the last paranoid days of Domitian, and his predecessor Nerva had done nothing to settle anyone's stomach or cure anyone's headache. But the force of Trajan's personality had calmed a growing political crisis that might have engulfed a lesser man. A weaker emperor might have invited ambitious generals to replay the tragic events that followed the collapse of the Julio-Claudian dynasty in 68 AD. But Trajan was no weak emperor, and the collapse of the Flavians was not accompanied by a destructive civil war. This feat by itself was an enormous accomplishment that is sometimes overlooked because it revolves around what didn't happen rather than what did happen. It's easy to hold a triumph for conquering Dacia, much harder to hold one for preventing a theoretical civil war. But of everything Trajan did over the course of his reign, the simple fact of the stability he provided was at least as important as anything else he did, if not more so. When the Julio-Claudians collapsed, there was war. When the Antonines collapsed, there was war. When the Severans collapsed, the empire almost fell apart. But when the Flavians collapsed, there was Trajan, and so there was peace. Trajan is remembered as a martial emperor because he opened his reign with successful campaigns in Dacia and closed his reign with successful campaigns in Mesopotamia. But when you crunch the numbers, he spent the bulk of his time engaged in the mundane toils of civilian administration. Indeed, for 7 undisturbed years after he returned from Dacia, the great general ruled an empire at peace. So what does a vigorous man of action do when there are no wars to fight? Apparently, he does everything in his power to enhance the material lives of the citizens that he rules. Trajan returned from Dacia laden with riches that he aimed to put to good use, and apart from his precious triumphal arches, of which there are more than a handful, he directed all of that money directly into the infrastructure of the empire. I already mentioned the new Forum Apollodorus built in Rome, but a new marketplace, creatively called Trajan's Marketplace, was erected in the capital at the same time, as well as an extensive bath complex, creatively called the Baths of Trajan, that covered up the final remains of Nero's Golden Palace. Elsewhere in Italy, Trajan had a new harbor at Ostia built to put an end once and for all to the silting issues that had plagued the port town for generations. He also built a new road from Beneventum to Brundisium to provide an alternative to the winding and heavily trafficked Appian Way. Roads elsewhere in Italy and the provinces were expanded, upgraded, rebuilt, and generally improved, with Apollodorus continuing to litter the European countryside with bridges across previously impassable rivers. There is no doubt that this investment in the roads did much to ensure the longevity of the empire, as both internal communication and the movement of troops sped up considerably. Of course, the Romans' magnificent road networks would eventually contribute to their undoing, as it allowed barbarian hordes to march from the frontiers to the gates of Rome with alarming quickness. But centuries would pass before that unfortunate consequence emerged, so we ought not dwell on it now. Trajan was consumed not only with building projects, but also general administrative duties. Though he delegated a great deal of responsibility to a grateful Senate, and did his best to empower governors to act on their own, there was still an avalanche of urgent, pressing, emergency, read first, triple exclamation point business for the emperor to attend to. To help us get a sense not only of Trajan's personal managerial style, but also the kind of action items that passed through the emperor's inbox, we are lucky to have at our disposal the letters of Pliny the Younger, a contemporary and friend of Trajan's. Had not Pliny been left childless, he might never have been compelled to publish his correspondence so that he would be remembered by someone, anyone out there. But he was left childless, so we get the benefit of reading through, among other things, real-time conversations between the emperor and a loyal provincial governor. I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent, but Pliny really is an interesting guy, and since his letters fill in so much of the detail about daily life in early imperial Rome, detail that gets left out of the monument, inscriptions, and senatorial decrees, he is worth pausing on for a moment. Born in 61 AD into the equestrian class, Pliny's father died when he was young, and by an odd little twist of fate, the younger Pliny's education was put in the hands of Virginius Rufus, the same Virginius Rufus who had refused to betray Nero at the beginning of the crisis of 68-69 AD. Young Pliny eventually traveled to Rome and continued his education, and while there, became close with his uncle, the famed naturalist Pliny the Elder. When Pliny the Elder died during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, his will stipulated that the younger Pliny should inherit all of his estates and be posthumously adopted into his family. With his uncle's money backing him up, Pliny the Younger then embarked on a highly successful trip up the Cursus Honorum. He served with distinction at every stop, and eventually became a well-respected lawyer, senator, and administrator who counted among his friends the historians Tacitus and Suetonius, and of course the Emperor Trajan. The emperor so trusted Pliny that in 110 AD, when the provincial government of Bithynia Pontus seemed to be falling apart, Trajan sent his friend Pliny to clean the situation up. In the 2 years that followed, Pliny and Trajan exchanged letters that touched on all aspects of imperial administration. The correspondence provides a rare window into the daily grind of managing an empire and Trajan's philosophy of government, which seems to be founded on moderation, tradition, and common sense. Among the litany of topics discussed were whether soldiers should be used as prison guards, no, keep using the public slaves, whether the emperor could send out some land surveyors, no, I can't afford to, but I'm sure you'll be able to find qualified provincials to help you out, whether Pliny could authorize the rebuilding of some public baths, yes, as long as no new taxes are levied and all other essential services continue uninterrupted, whether a volunteer fire company could be chartered, no, whatever the public good, associations like that always lead to political discord, how to handle criminals that had escaped punishment. If their crime was less than 10 years ago, round them up and put them to work in the mines. If greater than 10 years ago, put them to work as janitors in the public baths. And of course, there was the famous question of what to do about the Christians. Over the course of the last 50 years or so, more and more adherents to this strange new cult had begun popping up all over the Eastern Empire. Professing a monotheism that forbade them from worshipping the accepted deities of the Roman world, including the deified emperors, governors across the empire were vexed over the question of just what to do with these people. They seemed docile enough, but then again, they also seemed to be actively fomenting sedition against imperial authority. Pliny wrote to Trajan for instructions after being handed some lists anonymously that named active Christians in Pliny's province. The Christians were clearly violating Trajan's injunction against the formation of independent political societies, but how severely should they be punished? Trajan's reply was brief, but to the point. Forget about the lists, he said. Relying on anonymous informants is a slippery slope that leads to counterproductive tyranny. If someone gets hauled into court because there is independent proof that they are a Christian, then give them the chance to renounce their religion. If they don't, then punish them as you would any other seditious troublemaker. But if they do, then let them go free, no worse for the wear. Basically, there is no point in actively persecuting the Christians, but if they wind up on your doorstep unrepentant, then punish away. The question of what to do with the growing society of Christians in the empire would continue to befuddle emperors for the next 200-odd years, who alternatively ignored them, embraced them, or persecuted them, until Constantine put the issue to rest, and by that sign, conquered. Trajan's time playing the part of enlightened despot was a productive and beneficial time for the empire. And indeed, he was quickly given the title Optimus, or the best, to add to his litany of honorifics. But the emperor had spent his entire life under arms. There was little chance he was going to pass the rest of his reign in peaceful domesticity. Luckily for Trajan, in 113 AD, events conspired to provide the old general with one last opportunity for military glory. After the victories of Corbulo during the reign of Nero, Rome and Parthia had come to an understanding over the semi-independent kingdom of Armenia. Parthia was allowed to pick who ruled the kingdom, but Rome had to ratify the choice. In 113, the Parthians dutifully nominated a new king to fill the recently vacated throne, but the choice, the Parthian king's own nephew, was deemed unacceptable by Trajan. But the Parthians decided to test the limits of Rome's disapproval and refused to remove the offending monarch from the throne. Whether or not Trajan was waiting for some pretext, any pretext to launch a campaign in the east, or whether he was really and truly motivated to action by the question of Armenian succession, is still an open question, but the results were the same. Trajan headed east, gathered up his legions, and invaded the kingdom of Armenia. In 114, Trajan easily dismantled the Armenian defense force and overthrew the offending Armenian king, who would later die in Roman custody. The emperor, though, had no plans to place his own puppet on the throne. Instead, he declared his intention to formally annex the kingdom and reorganize it as a Roman province. He spent the rest of the year overseeing the creation of the new province of Armenia and demanding the recognition of Roman hegemony from northern tribes who inhabited the Black Sea coast. Had he stopped there, we could probably state with confidence that Trajan had in fact been animated to action by little more than the unacceptable situation in Armenia. But as soon as Armenia was annexed, Trajan immediately turned south and marched out on what was clearly now an open-ended war of conquest. In 115, Trajan emerged from the mountains of Armenia into the deserts of Mesopotamia and launched himself against the Parthian Empire. At the time, the Parthian kingdom was divided by internal political discord, which was one of the reasons the king had felt it necessary to place his nephew on the throne of Armenia in the first place, and the great empire of the east was able to offer little resistance to Trajan's invading legions. By 116, the Romans already controlled enough territory to organize a new province between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that Trajan dubbed Mesopotamia. He then sent 2 legions south to secure key cities, with one eventually capturing the ancient city of Babylon. Trajan himself gathered a fleet and set sail with the rest of the legions down the Euphrates River. After riding that river for a ways, Trajan ordered the fleet hauled overland to the Tigris, where they would continue south on their way to capture Seleucia and the Parthian capital, both of which lay on the Tigris. Encountering little resistance, Trajan seized the Parthian capital and, leaving behind a garrison, continued down the Tigris to the Persian Gulf, where he seized the important port city of Charx. In less than 2 years' time, Trajan had cut out a huge chunk of Parthian territory and annexed it into the Roman Empire. His only regret, expressed while standing at the shores of the Persian Gulf, was that his advanced age prevented him from following Alexander the Great all the way to India. It seems that the emperor's original intention was to conquer the entire Parthian Empire and rule it directly from Rome. But the swiftness of his victories hid the superficiality of Roman control. No sooner had he reached the Gulf than he was forced to turn around and deal with a Parthian insurrection led by another of the Parthian king's nephews. Though the legions were able to defeat the Parthian army, further revolt, including a serious Jewish uprising that was beginning to engulf the whole southeastern quadrant of the empire, led Trajan to scale back his ambition. Rather than attempt direct rule of Parthia, he decided to impose a puppet on the throne and make Parthia the greatest Roman client kingdom of them all. In late 116, Trajan was trying to root out the last holdout city in his new Mesopotamian province when he suffered heat stroke under the strong desert sun. Already plagued by supply issues caused by the spreading Jewish revolt, Trajan decided to withdraw from the siege, spread his troops out to quell the revolt, while he himself returned to Italy to recuperate from what was proving to be a physically trying campaign. In 117, he began the long trek back to Rome, but putting into port in Cilicia, his body finally gave out, and on August 9, 117 AD, the Emperor Trajan died, 1 month shy of his 64th birthday. He had ruled Rome for 19 glorious years. Now I know what you're possibly thinking at this point. Is that it? Here we are, talking about a man who led Rome for longer than any emperor since Tiberius, a man who's widely considered one of the 2 or 3 best emperors ever, and all he gets is the better part of 2 episodes? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. That's all he is going to get. The problem with Trajan is that we run into a paucity of primary source accountings of his reign. Plutarch and Tacitus and Suetonius all lived in and around his reign and prudently avoided commenting on the sitting emperor. So the key sources that we used for everything up to this point just sort of cut out around the reign of the Flavians. For Trajan, we are left with snippets from Cassius Dio, inscriptions from monuments, coins, and building projects, like the Triumphal Column in Rome, the letters he exchanged with Pliny, and scattered summaries from historians like Aurelius Victor, who would not be born for centuries. All in all, it leaves us with a dissatisfying amount of information about an emperor who was so highly regarded and who was so important to the present and future greatness of the empire. But such is life. We will run into similar difficulties with Hadrian, and then hit bottom with Antoninus Pius, whose only existent biography is in the Augustan history, a notoriously unreliable collection of imperial biographies that we should probably just pretend doesn't exist at all. But despite the lack of detail, the broad sweeps of Trajan's legacy are well understood. He was the first emperor to be drawn from the provinces rather than the Italian peninsula, a major landmark that allowed men of merit from across the empire to believe that every door in the empire was open to them. In time, other Spaniards and Syrians and Thracians, and most famously, a series of Illyrians, would come to don the purple and rule the empire. Had Trajan not been so successful in practically everything he set out to do, it is possible that the Roman aristocracy would have associated his failures with his provincial status and banished forever any other provincial from reigning, shutting off a pipeline of talent that would in time save, rather than destroy, the empire. Trajan was also the last of the great conquering Romans. The outward expansion of the empire had been a defining feature of the Roman character for hundreds of years, but in the last century it was a driving impulse that had been left to wither on the vine. Trajan reintroduced the glory and riches and satisfaction that accompany foreign conquest, and that for so long had been denied the Roman ego. The province of Dacia was an enormously valuable acquisition, and though most everything he took in the east would be abandoned by his prudent successor, the dispatches that came back to Rome detailing the capture of the Parthian capital and the seizure of a port on the far-off Persian Gulf were reminiscent of Caesar's dispatches from Gaul, and the people and Senate both reveled in the glory of it all. In the coming centuries, great generals would come and go, and great battles would be won and lost, but it was all in the defense of what the empire already was, rather than in the pursuit of what it could be. As I said at the beginning, Trajan was Rome at its greatest extent, and for that he would remain the envy of every future Roman general. Then there is the legacy he left administratively. He came to power inheriting your Lord and God Domitian's centralized autocracy, and left behind a substantially devolved principate that relied on the sound judgment of provincial governors and the input of the Senate. In all his letters with Pliny, he stressed over and over again that the guiding principle of all that they did should be the welfare of the people. Ruling was not about living a lavish life or indulging egotistical power trips. It was about guaranteeing that your subjects not only survive in a cold, hard world, but thrive in it. These principles would guide the policies of his successors, and Trajan's model of enlightened despotism would see the empire reach its full potential in the decades to come. In this, though, his legacy was all too fleeting, and the inevitable slip from positive monarchy to negative tyranny came just 60 years later. But for the next little while, all would be well with the world, thanks to the wise precedent Trajan set. His final legacy, though, was his choice of successor. Just as Nerva had balanced all of his missteps by bringing Trajan into the imperial fold, Trajan himself would put the cherry on the top of an already brilliant career by naming his former ward Hadrian as heir. Hadrian is on the short list of all-time greatest emperors himself, and the seamless transition from the one to the other turned the whole first third of the 2nd century into one bright, shiny package. But the trick to this final legacy is that Trajan may not have been the one behind it at all. We'll get into the early years of the next emperor's biography next week, but for now, let it suffice to say that Trajan and his wife Pompeia had been the boy's guardian after Hadrian's father died, and Pompeia was enormously fond of him. There is speculation, bordering on confirmed fact, that when Trajan died in Cilicia in 117, he had not yet named an heir, and that he may have intended power to transfer to one of the generals that he had left in charge of the armies in the east when he made his way back to Rome. Pompeia, though, had long lobbied for Hadrian, and when Trajan died without leaving explicit instructions, there is suspicion that she manufactured fake orders stipulating the dead emperor's posthumous adoption of her favorite, Hadrian. While not quite as awesome as Edith Wilson's secret presidency, Pompeia's clandestine plot to put Hadrian on the throne was a plot that bore fruit for Rome for the next 20 years and cemented her own legacy as a woman of far-sighted wisdom. Next week, we'll begin to unpack the fruits of Pompeia's labors and introduce an emperor who embodied the virtues of a Renaissance man, equally skilled in war and poetry and philosophy and rhetoric and architecture, and whose mind raced daily with ways to improve and refine everything that surrounded him. It should come as no surprise, then, that the legacy of such a learned and impressive leader is generally, Hadrian? Yeah, didn't he, build a wall or something?